Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to pull out the key insights from the information you need so you can get the knowledge without, getting swamped. And you've sent over a really fascinating mix of materials, this time flashcards on global politics, digital transformation, disaster response, quite the range. So our mission today, to kind of weave these threads together, find the connections, and give you some solid takeaways for understanding, well, the complicated world we're in.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting when you lay these topics side by side, you start to see how interconnected everything is. The challenges, the opportunities, they don't exist in neat little boxes. Looking at just one gives you only part of the story.
Okay, great. Let's jump right in then. Geopolitics, navigating all that complexity. One thing that jumped out was this idea that in today's world, this whole VUCA thing, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, it's not just governments calling the shots anymore. Why is it so important, if you're trying to figure this stuff out, to look at non-state actors too? The big companies, the NGOs.
That's such a fundamental point. The old way of looking at it, just focusing on nation states, it really doesn't cut it anymore. Think about multinational corporations. They have immense economic power, right? And that translates inevitably into political clout. They shape trade, they invest huge sums, they lobby governments. They're political actors, whether they intend to be or not. And then you have NGOs, often working right on the ground, influencing public opinion, pushing for policy changes, sometimes even delivering aid where governments can't or won't.
Right.
So the risks you face, the opportunities you might find, they're not just coming from state decisions, they're emerging from this really complex web of interactions between all these players. And that's where this idea of critical geopolitics comes in. It pushes you to look beyond just borders and, simple power dynamics.
Okay, so it's a much messier, more crowded field. Makes sense when you look at the news. Now, what about this framework mentioned space, power, representations? Sounds a little academic, maybe. How does that actually help you make better strategic calls when something big happens, like that semiconductor shortage we saw?
Well, it sounds abstract, but think of it as a lens. It helps you dig deeper than just the surface level crisis. Take the semiconductor shortage. Space isn't just Taiwan or South Korea where the factories are. It's also the political space, like U.S.-China tensions, right? And the sociocultural space, what drives consumer demand.
Okay.
Power. That's not just government rules. It's the huge market power of companies like TSMC. It's industry groups. And maybe most importantly, representations. How does each player talk about the shortage? Is it national security, pure economics, a tech bottleneck?
The narratives.
Exactly. The stories people tell about it. So using that triangle space, power, representations, helps you see the underlying currents. It's not just supply and demand. It's national interests clashing, corporate strategies playing out, cultural factors, and how they all influence each other. It's about those feedback loops.
That feedback loop idea clicks. It's not just separate buckets. Okay, you mentioned digging deeper. What about the local level? The materials talk about the dangers of companies overlooking local contexts. That Jaidapur nuclear plant example came up. What are the risks if you, say, are managing a big international project and don't get the local situation?
Oh, the risks are huge.
Yeah.
And they can linger for years. Jaidapur is a tough example of that. If you don't understand local concerns, the existing power dynamics in the community, the cultural sensitivities,
Wow.
you risk a total breakdown of trust. You lose legitimacy. And that can spiral really fast into protests, legal fights, massive delays. It can completely derail a project.
And wreck your reputation.
Absolutely. Wreck your reputation, maybe permanently in that region, especially for foreign companies, but really for any large organization going into a new local context. You have to do the homework, understand the local actors, their perspectives. It's non-negotiable for avoiding really costly mistakes.
So cutting corners there is just asking for trouble down the road.
Yeah.
And it's not always about big projects going wrong, is it? Sometimes companies get tangled up in geopolitics almost by accident. The L'Oreal and Hong Kong situation was mentioned. What happened there, and what does it teach us about how even, seemingly normal business decisions can have geopolitical ripple effects?
Yeah, the L'Oreal case is really telling. What happened was a decision that seemed pretty localized, maybe just a commercial choice about a specific market or campaign. It triggered this huge nationalist backlash in mainland China.
Yeah.
Boycotts. Intense criticism online. It highlights how actions, even seemingly small ones, can get interpreted through a political lens, especially in sensitive areas. People saw it as L'Oreal taking sides. It shows that companies, just through their day-to-day operations, their marketing, sometimes even internal stuff, they can shift power balances. They become geopolitical actors, intended or not. So for anyone listening, managing a business, you need to realize that even things that feel purely commercial can blow up geopolitically.
Right, you're never operating in a complete vacuum. The context is always there.
Mm.
Okay, thinking about analyzing these risks, how does this multi-scale approach compare to something more traditional, like a pestle analysis, especially when things are so volatile globally?
Well, the big difference is connection. Pestle looks at political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal factors, but often kind of in silos,
Yeah.
right? The multi-scale approach is all about actively mapping the links between what's happening locally, nationally, and internationally. It tries to show how different actors, states, companies, NGOs depend on each other. And critically, how an event at one level can cascade trigger effects elsewhere. It's trying to get at the causal relationships between these levels. So you get a much more dynamic picture than a static pestle snapshot. It's not just listing factors, it's understanding those feedback loops we talked about, how a local issue can blow up into a national policy debate that then hits global supply chains.
That cascading effect, yeah, that's key. And what about these conflicting ideas of space and identity? Like the China-Hong Kong situation.
Yeah.
How does that muddy the waters for companies trying to plan strategy or assess risk?
It makes things incredibly complex because space, like we said, isn't just geography. It's packed with history, politics, identity. With China and Hong Kong, you have very different, sometimes clashing narratives about their relationship, their identity. So if you're a company operating there, you have to be hyper aware of how your branding, your ads, even internal memos might be read through these different lenses.
Sounds like a minefield.
It can be. Something totally innocent in one context could be deeply offensive in another. That leads to boycotts, regulatory trouble, serious risks. So understanding those underlying representations, those different stories and identities, it's not just nice to have, it's essential for making smart decisions. Companies almost need to be anthropologists now as well as strategists.
Real tightrope walk. Okay, last point on geopolitics. The materials mentioned this critical awareness poses a challenge for traditional business education.
Mhm.
How so? What needs to shift?
While traditionally business schools have focused heavily on the technical toolkits, finance models, marketing frameworks, operations, sometimes with a, let's say, simplified view of the outside world. Bringing in critical geopolitics means broadening that curriculum significantly. It's about teaching reflexive thinking, understanding context, equipping future managers not just with spreadsheets, but with the ability to analyze power, culture, history, these complex, messy realities. Because today's business students aren't just going to be managers, they're citizens in this VUCA world. They need that wider, more nuanced perspective for responsible leadership.
That's a powerful point. Business decisions don't happen in isolation. Okay, let's shift gears. Digital transformation, or DT. It seems like there's a big gap between just, digitizing existing stuff versus a real fundamental shift. Why isn't just focusing on digitization, making things digital, enough for innovation and growth in the long run?
Yeah, that distinction is absolutely crucial. Digitization or digitalization, that's often about improving existing processes, making them faster, maybe cheaper, using digital tool efficiency gains, essentially. But digital transformation, that's way deeper. It's about rethinking the whole business model, creating completely new ways to deliver value. It almost always requires big structural and strategic shifts across the organization. So if you only focus on digitizing what you already do, sure, you might get some efficiency boosts. But you risk missing the boat on creating new revenue streams, entering new markets, basically adapting to how the digital world actually works. You might also just be papering over the cracks, delaying the really deep changes you need to make to stay competitive long term. True DT, as the sources say, it's really about combining a clear digital strategy with serious organizational change.
So not just new software, but rethinking the whole operation. And what about those building blocks for DT vision, experimentation, governance? How do they directly impact whether efforts to grow using digital platforms actually work and, scale up?
They're completely foundational. Without a clear vision, where are we going with this digital stuff? What are our priorities? Initiatives just become scattered. You can't scale effectively if you don't know the goal. And experimentation. You need that culture of trying things out, testing platform ideas, business models, learning quickly from what works and what doesn't. It builds agility.
Fail fast, learn fast.
Exactly. And governance provides the guardrails. It ensures experiments align with the vision, resources aren't wasted, and the platform grows in a secure, sustainable way. Like the material suggests, it's sequential. Vision first, then priorities, then experiment to make it real. You can't scale something you haven't clearly defined and tested.
Makes sense. Destination, route planning, and course correction. Now, what about the internal side? What challenges pop up when companies try to do DT by setting up separate, maybe more agile units, or try to weave agile structures into the main company? What should people watch out for?
Ah, yes, the internal dynamics. Creating separate units or using agile methods can definitely spur innovation, especially for disruptive ideas, but it's not without challenges. A big risk is creating silos. The new unit operates way over here, the core business is over there, poor integration, maybe duplicated effort, even internal fighting for budget.
Yeah, I could see that.
And you get resistance. Fear of cannibalization. The old parts of the business see the new digital stuff as a threat to their jobs or revenue. But the reason companies do create these separate units is often to protect those new disruptive ideas from the inertia of the main organization, give them breathing room to grow without being crushed by old processes. So it's a real balancing act, fostering the new without completely alienating or breaking the old.
Trying to fly the plane while rebuilding it, almost. And this idea of digital agility, a company's ability to kind of mix and match its digital tools and resources. How does that ability affect how fast and how far they get with DT?
Digital agility is super critical for making real progress. It's basically how well a company can quickly combine its digital assets, data, platforms, skills with its traditional strengths to create new value for customers. This agility lets you respond faster to changing customer needs, adapt to competitors, and keep innovating. Without that ability to reconfigure things quickly, companies get stuck. They can't keep up. Digital agility fuels that recombination needed to constantly enhance customer value. Think about, say, a retailer shifting rapidly to online delivery during the pandemic by combining their logistics with new e-commerce tech. That's agility in action.
So it's flexibility, really. Not just having the tech, but being able to use it creatively. Now, it feels like the goals of DT would change as a company moves along. How do those strategic imperatives shift across different phases, and why is understanding that important for building a realistic roadmap?
They absolutely shift. Early on in the digitization phase, the main goal is often cost-cutting, efficiency, using digital tools to do the same things better, cheaper. But as you mature into real transformation, the focus shifts. It becomes about growth, creating new digital products, maybe co-creating value with customers in new ways.
From saving money to making money differently.
Exactly. And that shift changes everything for your roadmap. The KPIs you track, the tech you invest in, even the best way to organize your teams. It all evolves. Each phase needs different resources, different structures, different strategies, different metrics. If you don't recognize these shifts, you might keep focusing on efficiency when you should be driving growth, or vice versa. It's like climbing base camp needs are different from summit push needs.
That's a great analogy, adapting the strategy to the altitude. What about established companies, the incumbents? What tensions do they face trying to keep the current business profitable while also investing heavily in risky, maybe unproven digital ventures? That sounds tough for leaders.
It's incredibly tough, a huge balancing act. Incumbents have shareholders expecting steady profits from the core business, but they also need to pour money into new digital stuff that might not pay off for years and might even eat into their existing business.
The innovator's dilemma, right?
Precisely. And they risk falling behind nimble digital native startups who don't have legacy systems or the same shareholder pressures. So incumbents often have to do two things at once: cut costs in the old business to free up cash and aggressively chase growth in the new digital areas. It's a constant tightrope walk.
Sounds exhausting. Okay, last thing on DT. The need for more research, specifically on sequencing initiatives and measuring readiness. Why is that ongoing research still so vital? Haven't we figured this stuff out yet?
Well, the landscape keeps changing so fast. What worked for one company in one sector might be totally wrong for another. A lot of the best practices we talk about might not be universal. Context matters hugely, so we need continuous research to refine our understanding. We need better tools for firms to actually measure where they stand their readiness across tech, culture, skills, leadership. And we need better guidance on how to sequence things, what comes first, what needs to be in place before you take the next step. Research can explore how different elements of readiness help or hinder the transition. As the sources say, a clear research agenda for DT is crucial because the learning never really stops in this area.
Right, the playbook is definitely still being written. Okay, let's switch gears again. Crises and disasters, unfortunately, very relevant. How does a company's basic approach to marketing influence how they respond when a disaster hits? And how does that affect the community's recovery?
It's quite revealing, actually. A company that's really customer-focused in its marketing might naturally prioritize immediate aid for people affected. They see it as part of that relationship building. On the other hand, a company laser-focused on efficiency might prioritize getting their own supply chain back online quickly to minimize business disruption.
Makes sense.
And stakeholder theory helps explain this. A company's marketing orientation shapes how it balances the needs of different groups, customers, employees, the community during a crisis. And that response directly impacts community resilience. A company that steps up and supports its community can make a real difference in how well that community bounces back. It's not just PR, it's about their fundamental view of their role.
So it connects right back to their core philosophy. The materials mention 3 views of how for-profits engage in disaster management: imperative, efficiency, and embeddedness. How do those different viewpoints shape decisions about priorities and resources when disaster strikes? Understanding these seems key for any leader.
Yeah, these views frame how companies see their role. The imperative view is almost reactive disaster. Happens, companies naturally step in, maybe opportunistically. Aid is immediate, perhaps ad hoc. The efficiency view is about leveraging what the company does best, logistics, supply chains to help effectively. Resources go towards efficient delivery based on their core strengths.
Yeah.
But the embeddedness view is deeper. It's about long-term relationships, reciprocity with the community. Companies with this view see disaster support as part of being a good neighbor, part of their ongoing engagement. They're more likely to prioritize longer-term recovery, building community resilience. So these views really dictate who gets prioritized: immediate victims, operational needs, or the community's long-term health and where the money and effort go. If you want to build lasting trust, that embeddedness view seems crucial.
That long-term commitment really stands out in the embeddedness view. What about nonprofits? They're often central to disaster response. How can double-loop learning help them be more effective? It sounds like more than just a standard review.
It is. Double-loop learning pushes beyond just fixing immediate problems that's single-loop, like our supply delivery was slow. Double-loop asks the deeper questions. It forces a critical look at the underlying assumptions, the core goals, the fundamental strategies. For a nonprofit in disaster management, it means asking not just what went wrong, but are we even focusing on the right things? Is our whole approach, our mission, still relevant given what we learned?
Rethinking the fundamentals.
Exactly. Rethinking their role, their strategy based on past experiences. It leads to more adaptive, more impactful approaches over time. It's about being willing to question the very concept of the organization in that disaster context.
So learning from the whole system, not just isolated errors. Now, we often use crisis and disaster almost interchangeably. Is there a meaningful difference that actually changes how organizations should respond? Seems important for planning.
There is a useful distinction, yes. A crisis is often seen as more localized, potentially more controllable. The organization might still have some influence over events. Think maybe a product recall or a factory issue. A disaster, though, is typically larger scale, often overwhelming, largely uncontrollable. It requires broader collaboration, external help. Think major earthquake or hurricane.
Scope and control.
Right. The materials suggest thinking of crisis on a spectrum leading towards disaster. Knowing where you are on that spectrum clarifies the scale of the problem and the kind of response needed. A crisis might be managed internally. A disaster demands coordination with government, other NGOs, the community, a much bigger collective effort.
Got it. That distinction clarifies the required response level. In our globalized world, how do businesses walk that ethical tightrope, balancing profits with responsibilities during a disaster, especially in a way that builds trust?
It's a critical challenge. Actions during disasters are under a microscope globally. While profit is key, companies have to recognize the ethical weight of their actions and the long-term impact on reputation. The smart approach, the ethical approach, is prioritizing those long-term stakeholder relationships over short-term gains that might look bad later. Acting prudently, fair pricing, genuine aid, supporting recovery builds that lasting trust. You can't undo the disaster, but responsible action can mitigate harm and strengthen community ties. And often, effective disaster management needs collective, collaborative responses beyond just one company.
So doing the right thing often pays off long-term in trust and reputation. It seems like how well disaster management works depends a lot on how vulnerable or resilient a community was before the event. How do vulnerability and resilience factor in, and what can be done to boost resilience, especially in more vulnerable places?
They are absolutely critical factors. Vulnerability is that inherent susceptibility to harm. Resilience is the capacity to cope, recover, bounce back. If your disaster plan doesn't account for a community's specific vulnerabilities, maybe poor infrastructure, lack of resources, social inequalities, it's likely to fall short. Boosting resilience takes a broad approach. Strengthening infrastructure, yes, but also improving access to healthcare, education, housing, fostering social connections, and developing tailored preparedness plans that address those specific local vulnerabilities. You need to understand the community's starting point to help effectively. One size definitely does not fit all.
Tailoring the approach is key. Lastly on this, how can international business research help tackle these big disaster-related societal challenges and connect to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs?
That's a really important link. IB research isn't just about multinational companies. It can shed light on cross-border disaster impacts. Think about how a disaster in one place triggers migration, refugee flows, disrupts global supply chains. These all have international dimensions and link to sustainability issues. So IB research can connect disaster response to these bigger global challenges and the SDGs. It can guide MNEs and international organizations on how to be more effective, more responsible agents of change after disasters. How can global collaboration, aid delivery, MNE capabilities be leveraged better? It helps see disasters not as isolated events, but as deeply connected to global economic, social, and environmental systems.
Seeing that bigger interconnected picture, right? Okay, let's move to our next topic, greenwashing. This feels increasingly important. Why do companies deliberately do it? Make these misleading environmental claims, even knowing the long-term risks to their brand and trust? Seems short-sighted.
Well, the lure is often short-term gain. A quick boost in legitimacy with green-minded consumers or investors, maybe. Or exploiting gaps in regulations or weak oversight. It can be symbolic, appearing committed without the hard, costly work of actually changing practices. The hope is to get the positive image, the marketing benefits of being seen as green, without the real investment or operational changes genuine sustainability requires.
Trying to get the credit without doing the work.
Yeah.
And what role does weak internal governance play? How does that make greenwashing more likely? You'd think good oversight would stop it.
Weak governance definitely creates opportunities. If shareholders aren't paying attention to ESG or the board lacks environmental expertise, the level of scrutiny on actual practices can be low. That allows management to focus more on the appearance of sustainability, the communications, rather than substantive performance. You get that decoupling between talk and action.
Right.
Conversely, strong internal controls, effective supervision, that increases accountability inside the company and makes greenwashing much riskier and less likely. A strong internal check is vital for integrity.
So accountability or lack thereof is key. What about ESG ratings? They seem all over the place sometimes. How do inconsistent ratings from different agencies actually affect greenwashing?
Yeah, the inconsistency can unfortunately fuel the problem. Lack of a single agreed-upon standard creates ambiguity. Companies aren't always sure what really matters to raters or stakeholders, and this ambiguity can lead to rating shopping.
Rating shopping.
Yeah, focusing efforts and reporting on the agencies where they score relatively well, maybe ignoring tougher metrics elsewhere. It can encourage symbolic compliance, ticking boxes for a specific rating without fundamental change. Some research even shows that disagreement between rating agencies increases the chance of future greenwashing.
So the rating system itself can create perverse incentives. Wow. What about voluntary certifications like ISO 14000 or B Corp? Do they help prevent greenwashing, or can they sometimes mask it? How reliable are they?
It really depends on the certification's rigor. Some, like B Corp, are pretty comprehensive. They assess a company's whole impact, require verification, push for real change. They can genuinely reduce greenwashing. Others, maybe like ISO 14001, which focuses more on having management systems in place, might allow certification even if actual environmental outcomes don't improve much.
Just having the process doesn't guarantee results.
Exactly. So less rigorous certifications could potentially be used as a superficial badge, maybe even masking poor performance elsewhere. You need to look at the depth of assessment, the verification, the focus on tangible outcomes. Not all certifications are created equal.
Good point. Look behind the label. And how does a company's public visibility factor in? Are high-profile brands less likely to greenwash than, say, B2B suppliers?
Visibility makes a big difference. High-profile companies are under much more scrutiny from customers, media, activists. The potential reputational damage if they're caught greenwashing is huge. So they tend to be more careful, engage in less overt greenwashing. There's more pressure to actually align claims with action.
Just more eyes on them.
Right. Low visibility firms operating more behind the scenes face less direct public pressure. So unfortunately, they might be more tempted to go for symbolic gestures without the same level of substantive change. The spotlight forces a degree of accountability.
So public scrutiny can be a good disinfectant. Now, companies are pushed to integrate ESG factors. But why can this integration sometimes lead to trade-offs that actually fuel greenwashing? Seems backward.
It's a bit paradoxical. Integrating ESG is good, but the breadth of ESG can create issues. Firms might focus resources and communication on the ESG areas where they already do well, or the ones that are easier or more visible, while downplaying weaker areas, especially environmental performance, which can be costly to fix. ESG becomes an umbrella term that can hide these imbalances. A company might trumpet its social initiatives while its carbon emissions are still terrible. And there's a temptation to maybe fudge the more subjective S or G metrics rather than tackle hard, measurable E metrics.
Selectively highlighting the positive. Okay, last point on greenwashing. What's the impact on employees? Morale, engagement, turnover. What does it say about internal culture?
Oh, it can be incredibly damaging internally. When employees see their company being dishonest publicly about its values or impact, it breeds cynicism, it erodes pride, lowers job satisfaction, reduces engagement, it damages the culture, maybe even performance. It really ramps up perceptions of corporate hypocrisy, saying one thing, doing another. And that hypocrisy is a strong driver of turnover intentions. People want to work for organizations they feel have integrity. So greenwashing isn't just external, it can corrode trust from the inside out.
Undermines the whole foundation. Serious stuff. Okay, final major topic. Crisis communication.
Yeah.
In this super fast, always-on world, why does CC need to be strategic, not just reactive firefighting?
Because crises hit so fast and spread like wildfire now, especially with social media, reactive just doesn't work anymore. Crisis communication has to be a planned strategic intervention. The goal isn't just to respond, it's to minimize damage, restore focus, and guide the organization back towards its strategic goals. Think of a crisis as fundamentally disrupting your strategy. Good CC is about strategically managing that disruption to protect the organization's long-term health and reputation.
So it's about steering through the storm with a plan, not just bailing water. What happens if a company messes up the balance between effectiveness achieving its own goals and appropriateness addressing stakeholder concerns? Seems like you need both.
Absolutely. Fail to balance those, and you're in trouble. Focus only on your own goals. Ignore stakeholder feelings. You risk escalating backlash, destroying reputation, losing trust completely. But focus only on stakeholder concerns without considering your own strategic needs or operational reality. You might miss chances to control the narrative or protect the business long term. Real competence in crisis comms is finding that sweet spot, balancing your goals with stakeholder expectations. Get it wrong, and you miss the chance to rebuild trust, show empathy. You just make the crisis worse, longer.
A delicate dance indeed. Being strategic and empathetic, how does the regenerative crisis model help manage those evolving, ongoing crises, like a long data breach or complex social issues? Sounds more fluid.
Exactly, it's designed for fluidity. Traditional models can be a bit linear. The regenerative model emphasizes continuous reassessment. You have to keep monitoring the situation, stakeholder sentiment, and be willing to adapt your response as things change. It's not one statement and done. It integrates issues management, risk management, reputation management into an ongoing cycle. It recognizes that many crises aren't neat, contained events. They evolve. Your communication has to evolve with them. Be agile.
Constant learning and adjusting. Makes sense for messy situations. Now, SCCT situational crisis communication theory matches crisis type to response strategy. What determines that match, and how does something like public moral outrage throw a wrench in the works?
SCCT's core idea is matching response to perceived responsibility. First, you assess how much do stakeholders blame the organization. Based on that blame level, you choose a strategy. Deny responsibility, diminish the perceived crisis severity, or rebuild trust through apology and compensation. But strong moral outrage complicates this neat formula. When people are truly outraged, maybe due to perceived ethical failure, lack of empathy, they demand more than a technically correct response based on blame.
They want more than just words.
Yes, they want value alignment. They want to see sincere remorse, real action, compassion. A standard SCCT response might feel cold, calculated, totally inadequate. When outrage is high, demonstrating shared values and genuine empathy becomes paramount. It overrides the simple blame calculation.
So the emotional temperature really changes the required response.
Yeah.
What about stealing thunder? Revealing bad news yourself before others do. Sounds risky. Why is it considered critical for timing? And why are managers so hesitant?
Stealing thunder can feel risky, but it's often incredibly effective. By breaking the bad news yourself, you get to frame it first. You control the initial narrative, show transparency, express remorse, maybe outline corrective actions. It often lessens the overall negative impact compared to being exposed by media or critics.
Get ahead of the story.
Exactly. But managers hesitate, understandably. Fear of negative reaction, fear of drawing attention to something that might have stayed hidden, reluctance to admit fault. Despite that hesitation, the evidence suggests proactive disclosure, handled well, usually leads to less long-term damage and builds more trust than trying to hide things.
Facing the music proactively can be better. In rhetorical arena theory, how did that change our view of crisis comms? Moving from the company broadcasting a message to this idea of multiple voices engaging.
It offers a much more realistic view. It says a crisis isn't just the organization talking at stakeholders. It's a dynamic, multivocal event playing out in various public spaces or arenas online, traditional media, community forums. You have the media, activists, employees, the public, all weighing in, shaping the narrative. So this theory pushes you to map these different arenas, understand who's saying what, supportive, critical, neutral, and tailor your engagement accordingly. It's not a monologue, it's a complex conversation or sometimes argument with many participants reacting to the crisis and to how the organization is responding.
So you need to listen to and engage with the whole conversation, not just talk. Finally, empathy. Such a human element.
Yeah.
How does it shape how organizations respond and how the public reacts, especially in emotional or ethical crises? Seems crucial, but maybe overlooked.
It's absolutely crucial and maybe sometimes underestimated in planning. Genuine empathy from an organization towards those affected. It's powerful. It can reduce anger, alienation, start rebuilding that connection and trust. It's about the tone, the sincerity of apologies, how information is delivered. Does it feel like the organization cares?
The human touch.
Exactly. In really emotional crises, showing empathy isn't just a soft skill, it's like psychological first aid for those impacted. And it's vital for reputation repair. A lack of empathy, or worse, a fake display of it, can be incredibly damaging. It fuels anger, deepens distrust, makes recovery much harder. It really highlights that human connection has to be central to crisis response.
Really brings it home. You're dealing with people.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We've pulled together threads from all those sources, connecting things that might seem separate but really aren't. We've touched on navigating global political risk, the huge shifts in digital transformation, acting responsibly in disasters, the tricky world of green claims, and how vital strategic crisis communication is now.
And what really stands out is that interconnectedness, isn't it? A geopolitical flare-up hits digital supply chains. Disaster recovery might use new digital tools. A bad crisis response can make greenwashing suspicions explode. Understanding these links isn't just academic. It's essential for anyone trying to navigate today's world, leading a company, running a nonprofit, or just being an informed citizen.
For sure. And these materials, detailed as they are, they really just scratch the surface, don't they? There's so much more depth to each of these areas.
Precisely. It's a starting point for much deeper exploration.
So a final thought for everyone listening to chew on, thinking about all this interconnectedness we've discussed. What's the one area that really hits home for you? The one you see as most critical for success going forward in your work or just for society? And what other questions does it spark for you? Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.